the room, the door was open, and inside was a map of Alaska. And the southern half of it was covered with pins. I walked in to ask the resident man about to graduate, Bob, what are you doing to Alaska? Is this voodoo that you're committing, or planning an invasion? He said, neither. I'm going to go there. I'm graduating and I'm going to go to Alaska. I said, well, what are the pins? He said, those are our parishes. Our parishes in Alaska. Yeah, these are the Tlingit Indians, and these are the Athabascans, and these are the Yupik and the Eskimo. And wait a minute. Time out. There are Native Americans who are Orthodox? Never crossed my mind. And he said, yeah, of course. Alaska was part of the Russian Empire for almost 130 years. Here are my two lifelong interests overlapping, and I don't even need a passport. I just need a job. So my first year in seminary, I wrote desperately to find a job because that same year was the year they announced the canonization of St. Herman. I've always wanted to go anyway. This is the once-in-a-lifetime celebration. This is the year to go, and I was not successful. No matter how many letters I wrote, I got either rejections or no reply. I gave up completely on going to Alaska.
Which seminary did you go to?
St. Vladimir's. So I gave up any hope of going to Alaska. And then unbeknownst to me, down the hall in the same dorm, another guy got an invitation to Alaska. But I had a roommate like this at Georgetown. There are those people from New York City in particular, not the state of New York, but the city of New York, who believe that the sun rises on the East River and sets on the Hudson. In other words, their whole world is just Manhattan. And this guy who got the invitation to Alaska was one of those kind of New Yorkers. He was totally uninterested in going. Actually, his idea of the West, I often joke, was New Jersey. And he never went there either. So George was not interested, and he asked his roommates, you want to go to Alaska? You want to go to Alaska? They had other commitments. So he just came down the hall. This had to be God's will, because my whole life has changed by this one afternoon. If I hadn't been in my room, someone else would have gone to Alaska. I might have maybe never have made it there. But I was sitting, doing nothing particular at my desk, door knocked, and he comes in and says, you're going to think, these are his words, you're going to think I'm crazy, Mark, but would you be at all interested in going to Alaska this summer? After they picked me up, I think I fell off my chair. 2 weeks later, I was in Alaska.
Nice.
I was in Kodiak. They put me into a flying machine called a Grumman Goose. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they don't make them anymore, but I think that's a pity. Because, well, I didn't know anything about this flying machine either. Rather large, pot-bellied plane with two propellers. But it waddled off the airstrip and belly flopped onto the ocean. Then it started one propeller, threw a lot of water against that window. Another propeller. It felt more like a submarine than an airplane. And then it started ever so slowly to try to fly. It didn't seem like it would ever. It bounced along the surface of the ocean and finally got airborne. And then it flew over some of the most magnificent country I'd ever seen in the world. So beautiful. I was already in love with the place. Then it belly flopped on the North Pacific Ocean, skidded across the surface, waddled ashore, and kind of threw me out the side door. Welcome to Alaska. My plane was almost immediately surrounded by my future students. Mostly 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. I wasn't disappointed or shocked, but I was surprised. They were all wearing Nike Keds. They all spoke English. They all played basketball. They all ate pizza. They were like kids anyplace else in the United States. The cultural differences were not obvious. I was the only one there in 4th century attire, right? And then I started to teach them. And nothing seemed to go right. I wasn't the only rookie teacher. We have this pattern since the time of St. Herman. We recruit people to come teach in rural Alaska under false pretenses. We promise them everything. Gregory Shelikoff told the missionaries from Valom, Finland, there was a church, there was a building, all their supplies were already there, the people were thirsting for baptism, he had personally baptized so many, none of it was true. He hadn't baptized anybody, there was no church, but
he recruited the monks to walk. That's what happened anyway, to come from Finland to Alaska. Gregory Shelikoff, under government orders, was the founder of the Russian-American Fur Trading Company, and in order to get his monopoly, he tried to persuade Empress Catherine the Great to give him a lot of stuff. She rejected almost everything he proposed, except for one. He told her that he had conquered, or persuaded, he didn't say conquered, 20,000 Aleuts to join the Russian Empire. Actually, he did it at cannon point, but that's another story. And he massacred hundreds of them. But he didn't mention that to Her Imperial Majesty. He did say, however, that he brought 20,000 Native Alaskans into the empire, and he wanted a priest to meet their spiritual needs. Catherine was smarter than that. Gregory, if you brought in 20,000 new potential Christians, they hadn't been baptized, you're going to need at least 10 priests. Well, he wasn't planning to recruit or pay for 10 priests. And then she said, and you provide transportation for them to get to Alaska. Well, I said this afternoon, so it's a bit redundant for you, but where are you going to get 10 priests to volunteer to go to Alaska in 1794? It hadn't been mapped yet. There wasn't even a map of Alaska. You didn't even know where it was, how big it was, where it was. And you might come to think of it, you might be able to get some zealous new seminary graduates, right? But not their matushki. And he realized that it's doomed. I'm not going to find 10 married. Besides, taking 10 married priests means their families. How many mouths is that going to be to feed, right? So he went to Vallam Monastery and recruited 10 monks. Gregory Shelikoff's idea of providing transportation was to buy them new shoes. They walked 8,000 miles across what is now European and Asia, Siberian Russia. Almost a year of walking. And then when they finally got into a ship, brought them to Kodiak, September 24th, 1794. That's the date we calculate the founding of our church. The arrival of the Vallam monks from Vallam, Finland, coming to Alaska, arriving on Kodiak in 1794. And they realized almost immediately that none of the promises that they had been made were true. There was no church, there was no house, there were no supplies, there weren't even candles and incense for services. And they also realized that the native people were being exploited, I would say, not quite enslaved, because the people weren't there permanently to make them constantly work. But when the company wanted something, they literally went out at gunpoint and said, get us what we want. We want 100 sea otter pelts by sundown. And if you don't provide them, of course there's no point in killing the people. You need the hunters to do the hunting, so killing off the hunters would be counterproductive. But we'll blow up your smokehouses, where you've spent since June and July, all summer, putting up the salmon that you're going to feed your kids all winter. We're going to blast all that out. And your children will be hungry this winter, because, okay, we'll go, right, under those circumstances. And these kind of techniques that the fur company was using on the people that the monks had come to convert to Christianity. So you can see they were completely opposite objectives. The company trying to make as much money as possible, and the monks trying to convert the people to Christianity, when the so-called Christians, the Russians who were already there, were treating them horribly. And illegally, by the way. It was a crime. It was against the law what they were doing. But St. Petersburg and Kodiak are exactly opposite sides of the planet. So who's going to squeal? And how are they going to find out? This is the story of St. Herman that we don't talk about. St. Herman became a whistleblower. He and the other monks wrote back to St. Petersburg, and actually to Irkutsk, the governor, and said, what's going on here is these are atrocities. This is unchristian. It's really illegal. Someone should come and put a stop to this. So the leader of the monks, Father Yoasaf, Archimandrit Yoasaf, was invited to go back to Russia and report directly to the authorities. They ordained him Bishop of Kodiak, the only person who's ever had that title, with authority to arrest the leaders of the Russian-American company in Kodiak. That would have put an end to all of this injustice. And so he was on his way back, sailing from the Siberian coast to Kodiak with one or two of the other monks who had gone with him, and the ship sank. And this regime lasted another 20 years, to the point where it wasn't safe for St. Herman anymore to stay in Kodiak. He didn't go to Spruce Island 4 miles away because he was looking for a quiet place to pray. You can walk 100 yards out of Kodiak and you're already in the wilderness. It wasn't a big town. There was only a couple hundred people there. He didn't need to go to another island to have a quiet place to pray. He had to go to the other island because they were trying to kill him on Kodiak Island. And you see, unfortunately, none of this is mentioned in our liturgical text. If you sing the Akathistos to St. Herman, it's all about what a prayerful, humble, monastic he was, founder of monasticism in America, first monk in America. It's all about his personal piety. That's not why the Aleutians loved him. They loved him because he had the courage to stand up for what was right, at great personal risk. And he kept that campaign up even when he was the last one of the 10. He was the only one left. He was the only one still writing the letters and pleading for a government intervention to bring justice, actually to bring peace. The new governor, Simeon Yanovsky, came in 1818. He came straight to Spruce Island because he had all these letters. He wanted to know, you wrote all these letters, what's all this about? Can you substantiate any of your accusations? Because if there had been death records, the number of people who died going out in the ocean and never coming back, because they were forced to go even when they didn't want to, the number of people who suffered at the hands of the previous regime, the Buranov regime, he says, I can't substantiate anything. You're just going to have to take my word for it. We were never given even paper to keep such records. But I can tell you, our people cry tears of blood. That's a quotation from St. Herman. Our people cry tears of blood. Help us to know what comfort is. Give these people some joy. And the new governor not only changed all the policies, but he was so affected by St. Herman, he resigned his commission and went back to Russia and entered a monastery himself. So that was the kind of impact St. Herman had. But he's glorified by our church, at least liturgically. It's not wrong that he prayed, and it's not wrong that he fasted, and it's not wrong that he kept his monastic rule out in the woods by himself, but that's not why he was canonized. It's not why the Aleut people revered him. It's not why they built a chapel over his grave on the 100th anniversary of his arrival. It's not why he was canonized. He was canonized because they remembered how courageous he was in basically standing up against all odds, pleading for justice and mercy and kindness for the Aleut people. Here's the point. He could have turned around and gone right back as soon as he found out that all Shelikov's promises were bogus. Most of us would have done that. But you've come halfway around the world. You've walked 8,000 miles. You find that none of the promises you were made were true. You don't even have a house to live in. There's no food for you to eat. The monks were scrounging on the beach, digging clams and shellfish, trying to catch whatever they could just to survive that first winter. They lived miserably. Giving up and going home was certainly a reasonable option. But like I think I could say, St. Herman loved the place from the beginning. He loved the place, and he loved the people. I think this is the most important principle for any mission, any Christian mission. You can't save what you don't love. You can't save what you don't love. You can't save America without loving America. You can't stand on the outside and rail against all its defects and sins. We have plenty of defects and sins, I'm not saying that. But you still have to love the place. And I think you have to physically love the geographic location where you are. Because St. Herman loved Spruce Island. He hated to leave. And if he had to leave, he came back that same day. And if he couldn't get back, he didn't even sleep. He had to be home. He had to be in that place to say his prayers. The effect of this is obvious to anyone who has ever visited Monk's Lagoon, Spruce Island. You feel a physical presence of sacred holiness there. It's not something imaginary. His life of prayer in that place has sanctified that place. It has become holy ground. I told the story also this afternoon. I took a Greek man from Athens to Monk's Lagoon years ago. We got to the trail that goes about a mile back into the forest where St. Herman was buried. And that's where the chapel is, where we celebrate the liturgy once a year on his feast day. This Greek archpriest took about 3 steps into the forest and stopped dead. And he turned to me and said, "Father Michael, your church can be autocephalous." It was a strange comment because we weren't talking about church politics or the recognition of the OCA and anything like that. I said, "Father George, why here? Why now are you talking about this?" He said, "A lot of people back in Greece have objections to your ecclesial independence for all kinds of reasons, but I don't buy any of them. You have all the bishops you need, you have the seminaries you need, you have the monasteries you need, you have all the parishes you need, you have the priests you need, you have all the requirements for an autocephalous church. My objection was, you don't have any holy places. I've taken 3 steps into this forest, and it's here." And maybe even more extraordinarily, he added, "My sense of sacred ground here is stronger than any other place I've been except one. I've only felt this sense of holiness, this presence of holiness, one other place more." Of course, I had to ask, where was that? The tomb of Christ in Jerusalem. That's the gift this one man who said his prayers and stood up for what was right 200 years ago has bequeathed to us. But I think the principle, the missiological principle is, he stayed because he loved the people, and he stayed because he loved the place. You can't save what you don't love. But what you do love, you're willing to sacrifice everything for. And that's St. Herman. He came into an area where the Kodiak Alutiiq people had been defeated militarily and then enslaved, became, the furs were being extorted at their expense. And Baranov took hundreds of men from that island all the way to California to build Fort Ross. He took over 1,000 to build Sitka. He had no Russian manpower. There were never more than 500 Russians in all of Alaska. Who was going to do all the work? The local native people. They didn't want to. They weren't being paid. He took hundreds more and put them on the mainland to open the first coal mines. He took others to the Pribilof Islands to operate the fur industry there. He sent some just north of Japan. At one point, I calculated that from Kodiak Island alone, the fur company exported 3,000 men. There are only 10,000 people on the island at the time. That represents pretty much the entire adult male population of the island. So you see what St. Herman was up against. Throwing in the towel and going home, no one would blame you, right? And because the monks were writing those letters, they were under house arrest for over a year. There were no services. Why come to this faraway land in order to be arrested by your own people and be forbidden to even preach the gospel to the very people you came to baptize? That was their situation. No wonder people became frustrated and went home. But Father Herman stuck it out because he loved the place and he loved the people. Prior to this, I would just want to mention the Aleutian Islands were already evangelized. The monks skipped the Aleutian Islands. They went right to Kodiak, about the middle of Alaska. So about 1,000 miles, they just skipped right over. Why? Because the people there had already intermarried with fur traders who had come from Siberia. And when the monks passed through there, they found the entire population baptized and a chapel in every village. That's before the priest showed up. We date the beginning of our church when the clergy finally arrived in 1794. But Bering's voyage to Alaska was 1741, 53 years earlier. The fur traders, once they found the sea otters, were coming to Alaska, trading with the local people, and taking the furs back. And coming again, and taking the furs back. And maybe coming a third time, and taking no, never mind, I'm staying. It's a long trip from the Aleutian Islands to Irkutsk, but the money, each pelt was $10,000. So you have 5 buddies, you build yourself a little skin boat, not much bigger than 2 of these tables, and you launch out into the North Pacific Ocean in a skin boat that size, you won't want to go down the Potomac River in one of these. And they were crossing from Japan, from the Sea of Okhotsk all the way to Alaska, over 800 miles of open ocean in these skin boats, these flimsy skin boats. But it was worth the risk, because if you went home, you have 5 buddies, and you all each go home with 10 pelts. 50 pelts in the boat, and 5 guys. But 50 pelts times 10 is $500,000. It was worth the trip, like they say at Dunkin' Donuts, right? It was worth. Once, then our history books say they did this out of greed. That, there was a lot of money to be made. The cash registers were going off all over Siberia. But greed does not explain their behavior, because these are frontiersmen. We had this same kind of people in American history after Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana territory. They're called in our history books the mountain men. They're the Jeremiah Johnson, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett. There's a new movie out, not that new anymore, Leonardo DiCaprio, Revenant, right? Those kind of guys. They had them in Siberia too. They made a fortune in the fur trade. So did they settle down, buy a mansion, hire a butler, and buy season tickets to the opera? No. That would have been hell for them, right? They gave it away. They partied mightily for as long as the money lasted. It's always the taverns that make money at gold rush times, right? It's the same kind of thing. But they also gave large donations to churches, monasteries, hospitals, schools, museums. Irkutsk was a boom town because there was so much money coming in. But the frontiersmen weren't spending it on themselves, besides the parties they were throwing. Once they blew their fortune, they went back to Alaska and came back with another fortune and squandered that. And after a while, even party animals get tired of parties. They stayed in the Aleutians. Little by little, the entire Aleutian chain, these frontiersmen, most of whom, by the way, were Siberian natives and not ethnically Russians at all. They intermarried with the Aleut women. And so that's why when the monks came 50 years later, they had nobody to baptize. They had a lot of weddings and chrismations, and then they registered everybody so there would be a record of those weddings and those whose children were who, to legitimize all those unions. And then they went right on to Kodiak, where no one had been evangelized yet. But here's the point why I bring this up. All those churches and all those baptisms, and it's thousands of people and dozens of churches, were the product of laity. It was 50 years before any of the priests showed up. And I think this is another principle we need to highlight, especially since you're a mission yourselves. If you expect your mission to grow, don't depend on the priests. Not because they're lazy, but because they can't do it. It's just sociologically not possible for your pastor to also be your missionary. You understand why? I've had some priests in Alaska trying also to be the outreach person for their parish. You know who complains about that? Not the bishop, the parish. Father, why are you spending all your time with these people who aren't even church members? We pay you to be our pastor, right? You visit us, you don't visit them. They're not your responsibility, we are. That's the kind of, you see what I'm saying? The priest is your pastor to be your pastor, the people who are already in. If there's going to be any outreach, if anybody's going to come that isn't Orthodox, it's going to be because you met them somewhere and invited them. Come and see, right? And when you have a beautiful service like your Vespers tonight, people will come and they will see and they will stay. You have to have services that are intelligible. You don't have a language problem here, so that's already done. Okay, you know, if you do them all in Swahili, you'll only get Kenyans, right? It has to be beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. And then it has to be intelligible. Just having the text to follow along is enough to entice people, because you learn something about the Orthodox faith just by understanding what's going on at the Vespers. But a little sermon, I had Father Thomas Hopko, in seminary said, never have a service without a sermon, even if it's only 2 minutes long. Teach the people every opportunity you get, even if it's just a couple of minutes. Tell them something, teach them something. As long as you have beautiful, intelligible services with a little bit of education thrown in, the parish will grow. But who's going to come? The priest can't, you're not going to go door to door. We're not Jehovah's Witnesses. We're not Mormons. And besides, that wouldn't serve our purposes. We're not trying to pass out information. The mission of the church is to dispense holiness. And you can only get holiness in the church. Not information, not even Bible study. That's all that educational stuff is in order for us to come to worship, and in the context of worship, having God touch us. Now, I'm not saying that God can't touch you on the top of a mountain if you're out hiking. Or God can't touch you when you pick up a baby. God can't touch you in the midst of a crisis, the death of a friend or loved one. God can touch you anytime. But you can't be sanctified by that. It's my final theme. I brought this cross deliberately tonight. It has the icon of St. Herman on the bottom here, and of St. Yakov Netzvetov, the first Aleut priest, above him, St. Innocent Veniaminov, the first Bishop of Alaska and Metropolitan of Moscow, and St. Patriarch Tikhon, who was also Bishop of Alaska. So 2 bishops of Alaska who became head of the church in Russia, and then the Most Holy Theotokos and our Savior on the top. This cross not only has these incredibly beautiful and miniature icons hand-painted by one of my students in Russia, in Moscow, but it has the relic of St. Herman under the icon of St. Herman, the relic of St. Innocent under the icon of St. Innocent, the relic of St. Tikhon under the and the relic actually of St. Nicholas of Japan, whose picture icon isn't here, but I don't have St. Yakov, so we put St. Nicholas of Japan there. They're relics of 4 saints. Now, the reason I bring this up, we venerate the saints and icons and other holy things because it's literally our Orthodox teaching that holiness is communicable by physical means. You know how you catch a cold because somebody else had a cold? You catch holiness because somebody else got holy. And the things they touched, it's sort of like radiation and a Geiger counter, you know? If something is close enough to something that's radioactive, it itself becomes radioactive. If you just keep it there long enough. That could be dangerous, of course. Radioactivity could kill you. But a little bit in chemotherapy can cure you. And that's the way the church treats holy things. Because human beings cannot take an overdose of holiness. Just like you can't take an overdose of chemotherapy, right? It's communicable through holy things, and holy things, icons, crosses, gospel books. For us, most importantly, the Holy Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ. But those people who have who have been endued with holiness all their life, like Father Herman, they themselves become radioactive. The holiness is communicable, just like we know what it means when diseases make you sick because you've been in touch with somebody else who was sick, but you can be blessed by the holiness of someone who's become holy. And therefore the relics of saints are venerated because even after they've died, the bodies of the saints radiate holiness. St. Herman performed almost no miracles during his life. He made 2 predictions about a forest fire and a tidal wave, but we have no record of him curing anybody or performing any kind of miracle. All the miracles that were performed, attributed to St. Herman, happened at his grave. People went there to pray, and they were close enough to the holiness that was actually in his bones that they were cured. I knew dozens of people when I first went to Alaska who told me that as children, mostly as children, they were very sick. The doctor said there was nothing they could do. The kid was going to die of tuberculosis or pneumonia or whatever disease it was. The friends, the relatives did not give up. They made a pilgrimage to Monk's Lagoon. They brought a pinch of the dirt that had covered St. Herman's bones home and had the child taste it, eat it, or anoint, and they're cured. was a doctor who said there was no chance. The earth it's not St. Herman himself, it's not even his relics. It was the earth that covered his relics, radiated, you see. That's why I'm using this comparison. Touched by God, because only God is holy. Even St. Herman's not holy, but he lived in such closeness with God in prayer, in fasting, in keeping his monastic rule, in the sacraments of the church. He lived in such a way that he himself became holy. The analogies the Holy Fathers make is putting a rod of iron into a fire. Iron by itself does not give off heat, and iron by itself is not particularly beautiful. It could be all rusty. But if you keep it in the fire long enough, it becomes like the fire. It glows with the same redness as the fire, and it gives off the heat just like the fire. It's not naturally hot, but if you keep it in the fire long enough, it gets that way. That's an analogy I would make with the saints. Close enough to God that they take on some of the qualities, the holiness of God himself. And the radiance of St. Herman has cured thousands of people over the last 200 years. The Aleuts venerated him and built the chapel over his grave because he was heroic, because he stood up for them, because he risked his life, because he loved them. But then, because of that, people started visiting his grave regularly, and the miracles started happening, and they built a church, and 100 years after that, he's finally canonized. It takes a while for our church to recognize these things sometimes. But the canonization did not make St. Herman a saint. He was a saint when he was still alive, and he's been a saint ever since. The canonization the name canonization is the Western term. We have an official list of saints. It's called the canon. It's not like the canon at Matins. It's a different, so I don't want to confuse it, but the canon is the official list of saints that the church keeps. It takes the Holy Synod, an act of the Holy Synod, to add someone to that official list. So, and then once they do that, the Holy Synod also establishes a day on the calendar when they will be remembered. So when it came to St. Herman in 1969, the newly autocephalous Orthodox Church in America declared St. Herman would be canonized, added to the official list of saints, and his feast day would be August 9th. I have no idea why they chose August 9th. It has no particular connection with St. Herman. It was a convenient day that summer. Right? But that's good enough. You don't need any other reason. We're going to have a feast day for St. Herman every year. And the whole world will know about him, celebrate his services, read his life, and be invited to come. And over the last 50 years, thousands of people have come just to walk down that path and experience the holiness that one pious, holy man has given to us as his legacy. So this is the 50th anniversary coming up next August. The 50th time we'll be celebrating the Feast of St. Herman. I was there the first time. And there's a few of us who are still around. I was a young seminarian at the time, but there are a couple of priests. Father Daniel Hubiak, who's in this diocese, was there 50 years ago. And Father Nicholas Harris, yeah, he was there, yeah. 50 years, most of the bishops who were there, they're pretty much all departed this life. Most of the other clergy. There's one seminarian from St. Vlad's, Ted Basil, who ran the press at St. Vladimir's. He was there 50 years ago, too. So maybe we'll have a reunion next August with a few of us who were there 50 years ago. But the point being, he would have been forgotten completely, except the Aleut people loved him in return, kept his memory alive, wrote down reminiscences about what they remembered of him, even his physical description. But 50 years after he died, Vala Monastery sent a request to the Diocese of Oleska, interview the people who actually knew him before they're gone. So he died in 1837. 50 years later, in the 1880s, the Aleuts who knew him, most of them as children, were writing their reminiscences down. And 100 years later, those were translated into English and published. You see, things take a while. But still, the point being, this is a gift from God. A holy person is a gift from God. Yes, first of all, he was his own gift to God. And now God has given him back to us as a holy person whose holy relics exude holiness. That when we come to church, that's what we want. We want to get something we can't get anyplace else. What does the church give us that we can't get anyplace else? The body and blood of Christ. You can't get it anyplace else. And that's the holiest thing on the planet. And then some people have lived the Christian life so piously, so sincerely, so you could say fervently, they take on that holiness, and they themselves become purveyors of God's holiness. When a woman gives birth, 40 days later, we have the 40-day prayers. She's done something so holy that we shouldn't mess with her for those 40 days. She should be waited on hand and foot. It's maternity leave, according to the teachings of the church. 40 days, and then at the end, she comes to church, and the prayers could be easily misunderstood because it sounds like we're cleansing her from something that has defiled her. But that's not it. Holiness is dangerous, and you have to be cleansed from it. Bishop Benjamin, it's my last little story, but Archbishop Benjamin said, have you ever noticed that at a hierarchical liturgy, the clergy, in some traditions, all wash their hands before receiving Holy Communion, the body of Christ, into their hands? So we come with clean hands and hopefully a pure heart to receive Holy Communion. But the bishop washes his hands after communion. Why? Because he's given all the priests theirs. He's OD'd. He's overdosed. He has had too much holiness in his hands. Now that has to be washed. So the cleansing is not because of something evil or something dirty. It's just the opposite. It's too much. You see, that's why I use that comparison with radioactivity or chemotherapy. Right? Too much is dangerous. God says to Moses, "No one can see my face and live." It's not because God wants to kill us. It's just the opposite. He wants to embrace us, but he's too much. we gotta take holiness in small doses. So the saints are those who purvey holiness and give it to us in a way that it's sort of like filtered in a safe amount of sacredness. And 3 times I've been asked to anoint someone who was sick, and I've also put this cross on them with the relics of St. Herman, St. Innocent, St. Tikhon, and St. Nicholas of Japan. And I pray invoking those saints, through the prayers of those saints, Lord, give healing to this thy servant, and so forth. And 3 times, people with cancerous tumors have been healed through the prayers of these saints and the presence of their relics. Holiness is physically communicable. That's the teaching of our church. That's the experience of our church. And it can be through icons, it can be through crosses, it can be through sacred oil. God can use whatever. God can use the stones from the sidewalk out here if he wants to. But he wants us to know that these are holy people. And so he specially uses their icons and their relics to let us know. Follow their example. Love where you are. Love your place. Love your people. Bring holiness to them, and that mission will prosper. God bless you. Thank you.